Namaste friends. Today is a very auspicious day. It is the anniversary of Swami Yukteswar Giri's Mahasamadhi. So we will be discussing his life, some stories, and also this is the beginning of a webinar that I'll be doing on his book, The Holy Signs. So thank you for joining me today. We will begin with a chant. And this is one of my favorite chants, which I think is also one of Swami Yukteswar Giri's favorite chants. It is not often sung, and you will know why when I actually sing these words, because it perhaps sounds too stern. However, whenever I sing this chant, when I tune into these words, and especially the melody, I feel a lot of comfort and love, which I think was also always an undercurrent in Swami Yukteswar Giri's teachings. So we will sing this chant now and then we'll briefly meditate before beginning. This chant is, O my saint, wake yet wake. You did not meditate, you did not concentrate, and pass thy time in idle words, O my saint, wake yet wake. O my saint, wake yet wake, O my saint, wake yet wake, O my saint. You did not meditate, you did not concentrate, you did not meditate, you did not concentrate, and pass thy time in idle words, O my saint, wake yet wake, O my saint, wake yet wake, O my saint. Death will be at thy door, and you may not have time anymore. Death will be at thy door, and you may not have time anymore to redeem thy soul. O my saint, wake yet wake, 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 O my saint. You did not meditate, you did not concentrate, you did not meditate, you did not concentrate, and pass thy time in idle words, O my saint, wake yet wake, O my saint, wake yet wake, O my saint. Death will be at thy door, and you may not have time anymore. Death will be at thy door, and you may not have time anymore to redeem thy soul. O my saint, wake yet wake, 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 O my saint. Let's briefly pause in the vibration of that chant, feeling Swami Yukteswar Giri's call, waking us all to be saints. Also offering a prayer to his Guru Lahiri Mahashai and the great Mahavatar Babaji and our Guru Paramhansa Yogananda, through whom we have been introduced to this great lineage. Om. Peace. So friends, welcome to this wonderful occasion. Thank you again for sharing this with me. Today, as I mentioned, is Swami Yukteswar Giri's Mahasamadhi. It's such an auspicious day, and as you might already know if you're following this, just a couple of days ago was Paramhansa Yogananda's Mahasamadhi. He left his body on March 7th, and Yukteswar Ji left his body on March 9th. I don't know if there is more than a coincidence to that. There perhaps is. Nothing in this universe is a coincidence, but I cannot speak more to it. It is just interesting that we are honoring both the Guru and disciple at the same time of the year. And this is the time they left their body. What we call Mahasamadhi is the yogi's final conscious exit from their body, and that's what Yukteswar had 86 years ago. And we all know Swami Yukteswar Giri through Paramhansa Yogananda, of course, without which I don't know if he would have been that popular in the West or that well known. He was, of course, Yogananda ji calls him the Lion of Bengal. He was a great saint. A saint is perhaps an understatement. As Yogananda ji says, Yukteswar Giri was an avatar. He was a fully realized being who came to carry on the mission of these great masters of Jesus and Babaji and to uplift this planet as a whole. And what Yogananda brought to the West was actually Yukteswar Giri's mission, which was Larry Masha and which was Mahavatar Babaji through Jesus Christ. So you cannot separate these gurus from one another. But of course, every guru, as much as they are all fully realized and one with God, they all reflected, brought a certain aspect, a certain ray of divine light to this world, and we tune into all five of them. That's why we pray always in this particular tradition of Kriya Yoga. We always pray to all these different gurus, and each one of them, like I said, exemplify a particular divine quality. Yukteswar Giri, as Yogananda himself gave him the title, was Jnana Avatar, the avatar of wisdom. Wisdom was the quality of God that most visibly, most prominently reflected through his personality, and he was more than wise. He was an extremely intelligent, extremely centered, extremely dispassionate, wise yogi who was sent to actually train Yogananda to carry this mission of Babaji to the West. There are so many stories in the autobiography of a yogi of Swami Yukteswar Giri, and that's where we know the most about him. I can sit here and share story after story of everything that happened in his life, his experiences with Larry Masha, Babaji, all the different stories that Yogananda himself had with his own guru. There is so much to share, and I'm not going to get into that because we are going to shift our attention slightly on the other side today, because we are going to introduce also his book, the only book of Yukteswar that I know is widely available and that we all have access to today, this book, The Holy Science. And today is the first class that I'm starting. I will continue the series on every other Friday in the mornings, but I thought, although today is a Wednesday, this is a very auspicious beginning for this new series. So we will also be touching upon this particular book, The Holy Science, which is, as I said, one of the most widely available books of Sri Yukteswar. Now I say that because as I was researching and I was reading more about Yukteswar Ji's life and all the things that he did, I was rather impressed to read about all the other books that he had written. Now, I have been researching for the last few days. I have not able to get my hands on any of the other books that Swami Yukteswar Giri wrote. So, if any of you watching this have access to or know where to find any other written material by Yukteswar Ji, because apparently he did publish quite a few other books also. And I'll briefly mention some of that because it's just interesting to hear about and to know. So if any of you have any clues, if you know anything more about the other things that Yukteswar Ji wrote or published, I would love to hear from you, because obviously, who wouldn't? This particular avatar, Swami Yukteswar Giri, he was such a bright shining light in the autobiography of Yogi from the very beginning. As Yogananda Ji starts the very first sentence of the book talking about the disciple-guru relationship, and then he says, I was fortunate to meet one such Christ-like soul. It is the very beginning of the book, and as you read the book, as you tune into who Yogananda was and who Yukteswar was, you realize that this entire autobiography of a yogi that Master wrote, when I say Master, I am referring to Paramhansa Yogananda, and this entire book is a treatise on Guru-disciple relationship, or rather disciple-guru relationship as Yogananda Ji referred to it. Because all of this comes down to that relationship with that God-realized soul who can take us to the other side, who can come as God's boatman. That's what Yogananda Ji himself called this particular role that he played as the Guru, as God's boatman who has come here to carry us across this ocean of suffering. So this whole book, The Autobiography of a Yogi, perhaps one of the most popular spiritual books in the West, even today, so many years, 70, 80 years after it was written, is a treatise on Guru-disciple relationship. It is the sweetness that Yogananda ji and Swami Yukteswar Giri shared. And there is so much that could be said about that. There is the sweet story that I was thinking about today as I was preparing for this talk. I did not find the source, so I cannot read it exactly for you, but there was this one disciple in Mount Washington, and he was an older gentleman, and both him and his wife and also his son, who later started living in Mount Washington, were all students of Paramahansa Yogananda. And this man did not have a lot of financial means. He was an artist, and I don't know what else he did for a profession, but he wanted to gift something to Yogananda ji. So what he did was, if I'm right, I couldn't verify this before this webinar, but I believe he collected walnuts that had fallen on the streets in some neighborhoods of Los Angeles, and he would just go collect them, he would shell them, and he would sell them by the pound, and with that money, he bought yarn, woolen yarn, and then he wove this beautiful tapestry with Swami Yukteswar Giri's face on it. And even today, if you were to go to Mount Washington, which is the headquarters of Self-Realization Fellowship, right outside Yogananda ji's room on that same floor, you will find that tapestry still hanging there. Every time I've been there, which has been a few times in these last years, I always pause to admire the devotion of this disciple to Yogananda, how sweet that gesture was, and also how much Yogananda ji treasured this gift, how much he valued that image of Yukteswar ji, that reminder that he wanted right outside his room always to see. His relationship with Yukteswar was so intimate, in that sweetest way. In many places, even in the writings of other authors, Yogananda ji is always referred to as Yukteswar Giri's spiritual son. They had this father-son relationship. And we look at Yogananda ji obviously as this great avatar who revolutionized, the spiritual teachings, and who brought these deep teachings of Sanatana Dharma to the West, the father of yoga, the first Indian Swami to take residence in the West. We see him as that great shining light that he was. But one is often surprised when you read some of his accounts and some of his own writings of how much he deferred and how much he referred back to his own Guru, Yukteswar Giri. He merely acted as an instrument for Swami Yukteswar Giri. This particular biography that I've been reading these past few days, I'll highly recommend it. I don't know if you can see this on the camera. It's called A Collection of Biographies of 4 Kriya Yoga Gurus. And one of the 4 Kriya Yoga Gurus in this book is Swami Yukteswar Giri, and I've been tuning in to his life and many different stories which I had not read before. And in this particular book, the author, Swami Satyananda Giri, who was a disciple of Yukteswar Giri, he talks about how Yukteswar ji used to write letters to the West, correcting, giving specific instructions to Yogananda. Yogananda himself was an avatar, but Yukteswar ji was constantly with him, constantly guiding every step of the way. And that is why in 1936, when Yogananda ji came to India and Yukteswar left his body, it shattered Master's reality. By Master, again, I'm referring to Paramahansa Yogananda. It shattered his reality in a significant way, because this was his pole star. This was that human incarnation of God that had come to play this role in this life for him. He, of course, said, I killed Yogananda many lifetimes ago. Nothing dwells in this temple but God, which is to say, Yogananda himself was a fully realized avatar. He was born this way, and yet he shared this sweet, intimate relationship, the disciple-guru relationship with Yukteswar ji in such a beautiful way. And there are many accounts even in this book of Yukteswar ji having that same reverence and the same sweetness towards his Guru Lahiri Mahashaya. So it is just so illustrative for all of us to just think about that, to meditate on that, what it really means to have a Guru. Because as I was saying, that is the whole essence of the autobiography of a yogi. As I said, we won't have time to read the entire sections of autobiography of a yogi on the different stories related to Swami Yukteswar. I want to read a small excerpt for you, which is from the time of his passing. This is an article that appeared, I believe, in Amrit Bazar Patrika, the leading newspaper of Kolkata, which carried his picture in the following report on March 10th, 1936. The death ceremony of Srimad Swami Shri Yukteswar Giri Maharaj, aged 81, took place at Puri on March 21st. Many disciples came down to Puri for the rites. One of the greatest expounders of the Bhagavad Gita, Swami Maharaj, was a great disciple of Yogi Raj Sri Shamcharan Lahiri Mahashaya of Benares. Swami Maharaj was the founder of several Yogoda Satsang centers in India and was the inspiration behind the yoga movement which was carried to the West by Swami Yogananda, his principal disciple. It was Sri Yukteswar Ji's prophetic powers and deep realization that inspired Swami Yogananda to cross the oceans and spread in America the message of the masters of India. His interpretations of the Bhagavad Gita and other scriptures testify to the depth of Sri Yukteswar Ji's command of the philosophy, both Eastern and Western, and remain as an eye-opener for the unity between Orient and Occident. As he believed in the unity of all religious faiths, Sri Yukteswar Maharaj established Sadhu Sabha, Society of Saints, with the cooperation of leaders of various sects and faiths, for the inculcation of a scientific spirit in religion. At the time of his demise, he nominated Swami Yogananda, his successor, as the president of Sadhu Sabha. India is really poorer today by the passing of such a great man. May all fortunate enough to have come near him inculcate in themselves the true spirit of India's culture and sadhana, which was personified in him. What a beautiful tribute. There's so many things, that speak to me in this particular tribute that came in a popular Indian newspaper. Of course, this is from so many years ago. India is poorer today by the passing of such a great man. It's such a sweet expression of stating that. And this another interesting note for all of us to understand Yukteswar Giri is this scientific spirit in religion. Now this is going to be the central theme that we will continue discussing as we even explore his book, The Holy Science, because what we see both through the biography of Yukteswar Ji and everything that Master brought to us in the autobiography of a yogi, and as we really meditate on and tune into his essence, you realize how scientific he was in his own inquiry and the way he shared. And by scientific, we even want to understand the word science from the right perspective. What does science even mean? Science doesn't mean that it can be proved in a laboratory. It can be proved in the laboratory of life, but not in the same sense of being able to measure something externally or through the senses. Science is experience that can be replicated. Science is basically a cause and effect understanding of how things work. Science is based on technique. Science is based on repeatability. Science is essentially the truth that is objective. And everything that Yukteswar Ji shared, everything, the way in which he approached spirituality and this path of Kriya Yoga was very scientific in nature because it was born of that deep experience of spirit. And also the way he shared was this objective truth that wasn't subject to various vagaries of human opinions or the way often they can be shared by different teachers. So that was a particular quality of Swami Yukteswar Giri. Now, before even we can talk about holy science, as I was saying, we have to go back to the year 1894. I don't know if all of you remember the story when Swami Yukteswar Giri was in this holy place called Prayag in India, where he met Mahavatar Babaji and this commission was given to him. But even before that, I want to read a few other things for you from Yukteswar Ji's life. As I said, he wrote multiple books, and it's interesting to even get a glimpse of what his personality was like. I'm going to read from this biography written by Swami Satyananda Giri. Now, it is interesting, Yukteswar Ji's name was Priyanath Karar. That was his birth name, and he took the Swami vows much later in his life. Both his wife and daughter, I don't quite know when they died. I think they certainly died before he turned 40. So by the time he was 40, he was already a widower, and his daughter, unfortunately, had also passed away. His daughter did have another daughter. So I don't know where the bloodline is today, but certainly he himself had completed all of his responsibilities and he was done with the world by the time he was 40. And when you read or when you study the early life of Yukteswar, you just realize how unique this person was. Of course, he was more than a human person, but also just to understand how unique this personality was that he donned. Now, it is interesting to note that Yukteswar was a scholar in many, many languages. He spoke fluent English. He studied French. He was a scholar in Sanskrit, and of course Bengali was his mother tongue, and he spoke Hindi as well. So he was a true polyglot, and he was so interested in the West from the very beginning. Even when he was a child, even when he was going through school, he would always question things that were presented to him just as theology or a matter of belief, and he would always go deeper into all the arguments made by the scholars. And I think later on in his life, before he turned 40, he also had an interest in the West. He was interested in everything that was happening in the world of science. Now we are talking about late 1800s, 1880, 1890, those are the years we are talking about. I can't quite place in my head what all were happening in the Western world or how he was getting this information, but certainly he was, and he was extremely interested in the scientific developments of the West. And he wanted to travel to the West, which he never did, interestingly. Yogananda carried that mission for him on his behalf. Yukteswarji, when he was young, he was preparing to go to Paris for an exhibition to Europe, and for that reason he also studied the French language. I don't quite know what caused him to not go. The biography just says there were circumstances in his life that prevented him from going. But while studying the French language, he also studied English around the same time, and he associated with a lot of Christian missionaries that were living around Calcutta at that time, because it was also a very important port for the East India Company, for the English that ruled India at that time. So he was very familiar with both the language, the culture, the religion, the biblical teachings that these missionaries brought. He studied it himself. And the first book apparently that he wrote, actually that's not the first book, that's the second book. I'll go back to his first book just in a bit. The second book that he wrote was a book in French, believe it or not. I'm going to read a small excerpt from his biography on this French book. Thinking about the glory of India and feeling himself to be an ordinary representative of India, he wrote a book in French based on his study of the essence of Christian religion. In order to learn French, he used to often mingle with the Christian missionaries of Chandannagar. One day he took the manuscript of the book and showed it to a missionary. That Christian missionary looked through the book and saw that in there was a new understanding and perspective of their religious scripture, the Bible, as it pertained to the arrival of Lord Jesus, his sadhana, education, the wondrous experiences of his companions, etc., and in the fundamental spiritual elements. The missionary felt that these conclusions would cause harm to the ordinary sectarian belief of the Christians. He said that he wanted to look at the manuscript in more detail and kept it. And he said, this will cause an upheaval in the Christian world. Because of circumstances, Swami Maharaj, which is Yukteswar Giri, could not go to the foreign country. He also did not try to get that manuscript back for a long time. Later, when he went to get the manuscript, the missionary said in circuitous ways, I've lost it somewhere, I can't find it. It's our misfortune and a loss for the world that we had to be deprived of such a magnificent discovery of truth. Sometime later we tried but could not find any of the papers on that matter. Isn't that interesting? Fascinating to think about Swami Yukteswar Giri having written a book in French on the teachings of the Bible, and how this Christian missionary, went out of the way to actually destroy that work because he knew how powerful it was. Now, as I told you, there was another book that he wrote. It's not actually a book, it's a collection of on the subject of the Bhagavad Gita. This is another sweet instance of how Yukteswar Giri constantly referred or deferred back to his own Guru Lahiri Mahashaya. So when Yukteswar Giri was living in Serampore, that's where he was from, and Lahiri Mahashaya obviously lived in Benares, which was quite a ways away. And he would often go see his Guru, but at other times he would also write letters and receive responses back. And he obviously started initiating people in the sacred science of Kriya Yoga. Lahiri Mahashaya authorized Yukteswar Giri to share Kriya with people. And so he had a group of his own students, Yukteswar Giri had by this point, and he would hold study groups on the Bhagavad Gita. He would study the Bhagavad Gita with other Kriyabans, and he would share his commentary and the teachings of Lahiri Mahashaya on that topic, and he would also write down and take notes of what others had to say, because clearly all these were very spiritually advanced, evolved souls that had gathered to discuss the Bhagavad Gita. And this is the part that I was saying was sweet, is is that he would write back to Lahiri Mahashaya to confirm or to validate some of the things that he was sharing or others were sharing about the Bhagavad Gita, and then he would collect Lahiri Mahashaya's response as well. And he apparently published this collection of his notes on the Bhagavad Gita also as a book. Of course, we don't find any reference of that in the autobiography of a yogi. Again, I don't know if it exists anywhere at all today. But again, just so interesting to think about how this man, this great yogi, Yukteswar Giri, was so intent on sharing and presenting to the world his own discoveries. So much was coming through him. It was just not the time. All of this was going to come through Yogananda more and more when Yogananda came to the West. But those seeds were just desperate to sprout even during the lifetime of Yukteswar Giri. Now, I told you he had written many books, and this is just fascinating. So I'm just going to read a little bit before we move on to Holy Science. Again, this is all from his biography. Let's see here. Yukteswar Giri devised many types of teaching methods for children. To make the difficult Sanskrit grammar simple and easy, he composed and published a book of understandable grammar in simple poetic form. At the same time, he also wrote an unprecedented book for learning primary English and Hindi called The First Book, and also created an easily understandable booklet of astrology. There's perhaps a lot more if I were to read from this book of the various works he published. But again, how fascinating to even think about. He wrote a primer for the English language to learn it through Hindi. You know, you think of the avatar. Of course, the avatar is here for a global mission to change the course of this planet. But here he is. He's writing a book of through which people can learn English easily. He's trying to make the Sanskrit language accessible. The way these avatars live is also so instructive for us, because we don't need to be an avatar if we felt an inspiration to uplift the planet, to share something meaningful, deep, and useful in that way. There's nothing stopping us from doing simple acts like that. And he did not, in his own mind, obviously writing a primer for English language or writing the Holy Science, he was not compartmentalizing them as one is, of course, of cosmic importance and the other, obviously, it's much more menial. I don't think Yukteswar Giri would have looked at it that way. I hear so many stories even from the life of Swami Kriyananda, and I hear that he never perceived or calculated in that way. So it is just so interesting for us to meditate on just the seed that these saints, these yogis, these avatars have in them, that is constantly trying to share their God communion with us, but not necessarily only in the highest of ways, but even in simple ways that can move us forward by one step. So I could read more and more from this biography all morning, but I'm going to move on, and we are going to talk about the Holy Science. And as I was starting to say, this book dates back to the year 1894. And there is this big gathering called the Kumbha Mela that happens in the city called Allahabad. Back then it was called Prayag, and I think now again in the year 2020 or 19 it got back to being called as Prayag. It's a very holy site where three sacred rivers meet, Ganga and Yamuna being two major rivers. The other is not actually a river, called Saraswati. It's an undercurrent. And in my demystifying Hinduism class, I was sharing about how Saraswati is symbolic of Sushumna, and Ganga and Yamuna refer to Ida and Pingala in the yogic science. But that's a tangent for a different time. But this holy place is considered holy for that reason, for the confluence of these sacred waters. And many, many holy men from India, sadhus, saints, devotees from everywhere around the country gather in this holy site every 12 years for this occasion of Kumbha Mela. And Yukteswar Giri also happened to be there, and that's where he met Babaji. I'm going to start reading from this book because obviously I can, while I have the book, why not? So this is actually from the introduction that Swami Yukteswar Giri himself wrote. He writes the Sanskrit verse in the beginning of this book. At the request, this is the translation of that Sanskrit verse. At the request in Allahabad of the great preceptor Mahavatar Babaji, near the end of the 194th year of the present Dwapara Yuga, this exposition has been published for the benefit of the world. That was the commission given to him by Babaji. Now, I also want to read from this particular book, because from the biography, a little bit of backstory of how about Holy Science. And how he wrote it. Because later on, as we go into the next weeks, we will study the 4 sections of the book. He had this inspiration to actually create a structure for unifying or presenting a unified understanding of spirituality from the East and West. And he has all these pitty Sanskrit sutras that are part of these 4 sections. And this is from the biography of Yukteswar Ji, where he says, written by Satyananda Giri, of how these verses came to him. Give me a second here. One night, at an auspicious time, he meditated upon the blessings of the spiritual lineage, especially the beneficent wish, directive, and encouragement of Param Gurudev, referring to Mahavatar Babaji. And while going through the process of analyzing the essence of the spiritual treatises of the East and West, he arrived at a framework of the substantial elements for the composition of the new book. He began to create Sanskrit sutras based on the unifying conclusions of Eastern philosophy and sadhana. Alongside those sutras, he wrote down the corresponding Western spiritual material that expressed the same understanding, using quotations from the Bible and explaining their underlying meaning in English. Now, this book, this was also something that I had mistakenly thought earlier that this was later on translated into English, but looks like this book was simultaneously written in Bengali and translated into English by the commission of Yukteswar Giri himself. In Bengali, the title of the book is Kaivalya Darshanam. Now, that's actually a Sanskrit word, and what that literally translates is the exposition of the final truth or the liberating truth. And interestingly, in English, he does not call it that. He calls it the holy science. And of course, I'm sure there are reasons for that. It's much more easily approachable. So this book was not translated later on, when it was published by Yoganandaji in the West. It was already translated during the time of Yukteswar Giri. Now, what was that particular commission given by Babaji to Yukteswar Giri? We have to look at that also. I'm going back and forth on that. I was going to read that story first. Now, as I was saying, Swami Yukteswar Giri was in the Kumbha Mela, and he ends up meeting Babaji. There's somebody who calls him. The whole story is there in the autobiography of a yogi, if you have not already read it. And Babaji, interestingly, refers to Yukteswar Giri in this occasion as Swamiji. And at this point, Yukteswar Giri in 1894 is about 40 years old, and he had already lost his wife and his daughter, so he was a widower at this time. So Babaji, informally or through his own energy, was initiating Yukteswar Giri into the sannyas order as a Swami. And then I'm going to skip a few paragraphs here. During my conversation with Babaji, we spoke of the particular class of men who now frequent these places of pilgrimage. I humbly suggested that there were men greater by far in intelligence than most of those then present, men living in distant parts of the world, Europe and America, professing different creeds and ignorant of the real significance of the Kumbha Mela. They were men fit to hold communion with the spiritual devotees so far as intelligence is concerned. Yet, such intellectual men in foreign lands were, alas, wedded in many cases to rank materialism. Now, this seed thought of the East and the West, how the intellectuality of the East was often associated with materialism, and how the spirituality of the West was often associated with dogmatism. As we are ushering in the new age, I'll talk about the new age just in a bit because that is also part of this introduction, this is what we are decoupling. That's the whole mission of these great gurus and masters, and the whole seed that is presented in this book, The Holy Science. What we are decoupling that materialism and scientific understanding, and we are decoupling the dogmatism and the spiritual understanding and all the great teachings of the East, and we are combining the scientific advancement with the spiritual understanding. That was the mission of the masters, to bring East and West together. And this all started, of course, with Babaji, then Lahiri Mahasaya resurrecting Kriya, and then Yukteswar Giri having this interest in the West and having his own scientific perspective on religion and spiritual teachings, and of course Yoganandaji arriving at his doorstep to to be his messenger, to be the missionary that was going to carry on this mission to the West. And of course, I also have to say, all of us who are sharing this, who are studying these teachings, who are listening to these great truths that were brought by these avatars, we are also part of that mission. We are all bringing together that scientific advancement. By scientific advancement, I don't just mean nuclear physics and this and that. I mean a way of thinking, of being grounded on the material plane and using material science to advance civilization, and using that also to grow spiritually deeper through these ancient teachings that have been preserved in India for ages. We are all part of that mission. So in a sense, as I was saying in the introduction video that I posted on my YouTube channel, we are all tuning back into our own roots. What are these roots? This root goes back to this conversation that Babaji had with Yukteswar Giri in 1894 in Kumbha Mela, where he's telling Yukteswar Giri, or Yukteswar Giri is telling, all these scientific men of the West, they could use so much from being in the Kumbha Mela, and the people that are coming here are not actually as spiritually refined as they might seem. And let's see where they go from there. I'm going to skip a few lines here. My Param Guruji Maharaj Babaji smiled and, honoring me with the title of Swami, imposed on me the task of this book. I was chosen, I do not know the reason why, to remove the barriers and to help in establishing the basic truth in all religions. That's another such a beautiful demonstration of the humility of these great masters. I was chosen, I don't know the reason why. Of course, he incarnated for this reason. He incarnated for this reason of demonstrating that fundamental unity between the spiritual teachings of the East and of the West. And everything that he did in his life, from his high school years of studying Sanskrit and the scholarly texts and the scriptures of India, and then studying French and English and studying the Bible and having this relationship with the missionaries, and also being so interested in the West and the scientific advancements there, even before the moment that he actually met Babaji, Yukteswar Giri was destined. He had all those ingredients. He had already done that footwork of preparing himself for this noble task. And that's why, as I read from his biography, one night when he sat, the book was given to him. All these sutras that we will later on see in these upcoming chapters, they all just came to him as these pithy Sanskrit verses that show the underlying unity of East and West, of Sanatan Dharma and of the Christian faith. Now, the introduction goes on further to talk a lot about astronomy, astrology, and the yugas. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this only because I already did a class on the yugas. I'll link that somewhere, perhaps in the description of this video. But certainly, it's very fascinating to read the original writings of Yukteswar. He's mathematically much more precise and accurate, and it is also simple. Sometimes people are turned away by the complexity of these calculations, 24,000, 240,000, what is 12,000, what is this, what is that. But actually, if you were to spend a few minutes trying to understand the whole Yuga theory, you will see Yukteswar's explanation in the introduction of this book is rather simple. And if you're hearing this for the first time, I realized I'm not introducing it properly. Yukteswar Giri, in the introduction for this book, presents this fundamental understanding that this planet itself, the planet Earth, is constantly going through this huge, great cycles of time. And depending upon where it is in that cycle, the mass consciousness of people, men, everything on this planet is constantly shifting. And how is it shifting? Because the sun is rotating around its own dual star, the Earth is constantly going on this very long orbit that's 240,000 years long. And as it goes through this orbit, at certain times, it is closer to the galactic center, which he calls Vishnu Nabhi in Sanskrit, and at certain other times it moves farther away. So based on the relative distance between the planet Earth and the galactic center, there is a shift in the mass consciousness of this planet. I don't know if that's too complicated an explanation, but if you read it, perhaps you will understand it more clearly, and certainly I'll link my other video somewhere in the description after this talk, and that has a much more clearer explanation where I spend a lot more time talking about it. There is a lot that has been written about the Yuga theory, and Yukteswar Giri in this book introduces that. Now we also have to understand that this book, having written in the year 1895, was presenting an extremely radical view of the Yuga theory. Now if some of you who are watching this are from the West, Okay, great. It's so interesting and fascinating, and if Yukteswar Giri is saying that, I agree with it. But for those of us who grew up in India, this is a fundamental shift in what we are told about the yugas and how they work and what is the length of each yuga, because according to certain schools of thinking in India, this current period that we are in, the dark age called the Kali Yuga, actually we are in Dwapara Yuga, but the dark age Kali Yuga, which started around 500 AD, is actually 400,000 years long. Now Yukteswar Ji says it's only 2,400 years long. That's a big difference, if you think about it. And Yukteswar Giri also talks about where these discrepancies crept into the calculations and what happened during the Dark Ages, because of which we have lost this true knowledge. And he even quotes scriptures like the Manusmriti, exactly translating the verses. And he explains also what was the confusion that led people to think that Kali Yuga is that long and we are in this endless period of Kali Yuga. So if you're interested in this subject, certainly read the Holy Signs, or of course you can find other material on the yugas as well. It is very fascinating to think about. What he's talking about is that now, where we are standing, now I'm speaking to you in the year 2022. Yukteswar was writing this in the year 1895. The 1900 year itself was a time when the world was being ushered into this new ascending age called Dwapara Yuga, where there is going to be a greater awareness of energy and expansion of consciousness from the Dark Ages. It's an ascending age where this planet itself as a whole is going to spiritually evolve. Of course, it's a cycle where the planet goes through ascending and descending ages. And right now we are on that ascending arc. I'll read just a few lines from this book. About 1600 AD, William Gilbert discovered magnetic forces and observed the presence of electricity in all material substances. I'm going to read even before that. Subsequent to this period, when the 100-year transitional Sandhi of Kali Yuga set in, this we are talking about the year 1600, to effect a union with the following Dwapara Yuga, men began to notice the existence of fine matters or panchatanmatras, or the attributes of electricity, and political peace began to be established. Again, if you study the history of this planet, of the various countries and civilization, you will find all of this to be consistent and true. What are panchatanmatras? Again, we will come to all of that later on in this book. He goes on to say, about 1600 AD, William Gilbert discovered magnetic forces and observed the presence of electricity in all material substances. In 1609, Kepler discovered important laws of astronomy and Galileo produced a telescope. In 1621, Rebel of Holland invented the microscope. About 1670, Newton discovered the law of gravitation. In 1700, Thomas Savery made use of a steam engine in raising water. 20 years later, Stephen Gray discovered the action of electricity on the human body. He goes on to write more and more. In the political world, people began to have respect for themselves, and civilization advanced in many ways. England united with Scotland and became a powerful kingdom. Napoleon Bonaparte introduced his legal code into southern Europe. America won its independence, and many parts of Europe were peaceful. It is just interesting to just think about all these correlations between how Yukteswar Ji presents this theory of the yugas and all events from world history. I'm looking for a particular line here that I forgot to underline. Yeah, this is the most interesting line. Perhaps we'll end our webinar here for today, because we'll pick up from where we leave and we'll continue studying the holy signs from the next episode onwards. In this book, certain truths such as those about the properties of magnetism, its auras, different sorts of electricity, etc. have been mentioned, although modern science has not yet fully discovered them. The 5 sorts of electricity can be easily understood if one will direct his attention to the nerve properties, which are purely electrical in nature. Each of the 5 sensory nerves has its characteristic and unique function to perform. I'm not going to go further. But the line that I wanted to call all of our attention to is this particular idea that Yukteswar just casually states, a lot is presented in this book, although modern science has not yet fully discovered them. Now, this is very fascinating again for us to think about as we study this book, because many things that Yukteswar talks about here, even the idea of sun having its dual, next week I'll talk about that more in detail if needed. But a lot of those astronomical facts and many other things he presents were not part of scientific understanding in the year 1895. In the year 1895, people barely knew what existed outside of the solar system. Yukteswar was talking about galactic center and the shift of the equinox and so many things. There's no other way he could have done all of this except by tuning into his intuition and from the guidance of Mahavatar Babaji. This knowledge, this book that he brought to us, and all the revelations and realizations he brought to us through this book are divinely inspired and were brought to us at a particular point in history for the world itself to rise up again, to ascend into this higher age. So this book is a very fascinating one. In the short trailer that I posted on YouTube, I forgot to post that on Facebook, I shared how this particular book is a daunting one. It is often perceived as one that is not easy to grasp or understand. And as somebody who's been trying to read this the past couple of weeks, I can certainly affirm that, attest to that idea that it is not easy to grasp. But at the same time, I think it is worth tuning into, even if we understand a fraction of what Yukteswar Ji is presenting, and let alone understand, as we tune in more to the essence of what he was talking about, into the vibration of a true scripture, I think we are tuning into that seminal thought that was planted by Babaji. This particular book and Yukteswar Ji meeting Babaji and everything that happened thereon is such a cosmic moment. It is as cosmic as when Babaji met Larry Masha to give Kriya Yoga initiation. So all of these, of course, it is particularly relevant and important for those of us who are drawn to this tradition of Kriya Yoga. But I believe and I honestly think that this is cosmic significance for everybody who is living here right now on this planet, because all that came through these particular instances, these points in space and time where these great God-realized avatars came to this plane and they manifested their life purpose and brought these teachings for us, is what is actually moving this planet itself into a higher age, into this ascending age of Dwapara. So friends, I'm going to end today's webinar here at this point. I know I went a few different places. Next week we will come back and focus specifically on the holy science, and perhaps we will start the first section of this book. Thank you again for sharing this time with me. If you have any comments, questions, or anything you want to share on any of the subjects or things that I discussed today, certainly let me know. And even if not, if you're watching this and if you want to share your particular inspirations or anything you enjoyed about this, I would love to hear that as well. I'll see you not this Friday, but this webinar is going to happen. I'm going to tell you the date. Give me 1 second. So this will happen on 1st and 3rd Fridays. So the next episode where I'll completely focus on the holy science will be released on March 18th. So until then, God bless you all.